Push notifications on voice-first devices like smart speakers. Good idea or bad idea? I took to Twitter this week to find out. So before we get to the results of the poll of whether or not you think that notifications on smart speakers are a good or a bad idea, thank you everyone for taking part in the discussion. We had a lot of insights sprouting up and a lot of interesting conversations going on. Before I get to the results, I want to just pick up on a couple of the things that people were saying and try and summarise and put them into context a little bit to see whether or not I can paint a bit of a picture about what the industry thinks about notifications in general. So we'll be looking at things like the types of notifications there are, and I've called it critical versus preferential. We're going to take a look at context and how context is important and the challenges of using context for notifications. We're also going to look at the whole opt-in side of things and how you control user preferences and stuff like that. And then we'll show you the results of the poll, which is interesting. So here we are. Without further ado, here is the poll. So before we start, we'll need to define what we mean by notifications. And thank you, Kathy Pearl, for saying it's good to clearly define what notifications means for smart speakers. Exactly, let's do that, okay? I mean, when I say notifications, I'm talking about push notifications, anything that is a signal that's sent to a device, that is then sent to the user, that is there to actively tell or communicate in some way, shape or form that there is something new or noteworthy or attention-worthy on the device waiting for them. So it's that, it could be interruptive, it could be passive, but it's the act of proactively pushing out a signal to notify a user of something on the device, okay? But thank you for that comment, and people have took it in different ways. People have broadly got the concept of push notifications throughout the discussion, but it is important to define what we mean. So that is what we mean. So voice strategies to kick things off. By the way, this isn't all in order of how it happened. I've just picked things out to put some sort of structure around it because stuff was happening all over the place. So to start us off, okay, let's have a look at voice strategists who saying, isn't it dependent on the information priority and context? Yes, it is important to take into consideration the information priority and context, and that was a running theme throughout the whole thing, priority and context. So let's just dig in deep a little bit into what we mean when we say information priority. And from the discussion that we had, I've kind of categorized all the notifications that were discussed and mentioned into two separate categories, and this might help with the priority. One category is critical notifications, okay? This is stuff that is in your best interest for you to know about, all right? So this is the high importance stuff. Thank you, Mark Webster, for weighing in on this. I think you phrased it as notifications are a helpful element of a proper product feedback loop. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Using notifications as a way of feeding back to the user something. So that's interesting. And then we had a little bit of a further discussion, and we went on to start discussing what he means when he says that it's useful to tell people about things that need their attention. So I said, what do you mean that, to tell me that my thermostat's not working, or do you mean to tell me that someone's beat my high score in the Harry Potter quiz? And then the examples he gives was pretty interesting. So he's talking about the thermostat's not working, it's time to take your medication, your lift has arrived, your flight is delayed, your mortgage application's been approved. All this stuff is the stuff that I would put in the bracket of critical notifications. This is all stuff that's in your best interest for you to know about. There's not really much of a discussion there. You can't disagree that if someone needs to take their medication and they're a bit forgetful because they're a bit old or whatever, it's kind of in their best interest for you to be able to tell them that it's time to take their meds. You know what I mean? If your thermostat's broken, it's kind of in your best interest to know that. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. The one group of critical notifications. This is what I would say is the high priority stuff. Secondary to that, you've got what I'm going to call preferential notifications. So there's a few people that have weighed into that discussion. Frank J. Radice, I'm not sure, apologies for pronouncing your name wrong. You're going to realise that this is a running theme throughout this whole thing, as I'm probably pronouncing lots of people's names wrong. So Frank J. Radice says he's posted an article there, and it's all about Domino's using Alexa to send you a push notification to say that your pizza's on its way. Okay, Ryan McInnes from Voices, by the way, Voices are featuring on the next episode of the podcast, so do check that out. Brian Colcord, the VP of Design, talking about making the transition from UX design into VUX design. Epic episode, check it out. Ryan says that proactive ones are ideal. Your package is arriving today, or Kanye West has just come out with a new album. Do you want to have a listen? This is the realm of preferential notifications. For me personally, I don't really care about Kanye West. I used to like his old stuff, not a fan of his new stuff. Don't really care when his new album comes out. Don't really care when my Domino's pizza's on its way, because I'll find out it's here when I knock at the door. But that's just me, all right? Different people have got to have different preferences, and this is where things start getting a little bit tricky. So that's the priority of the information. The critical information, high priority; preferential information, lower priority, based on user preferences. That's the way that I would kind of summarize it anyway. But the preferential side of things is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So one of the things is, how do you actually notify people? What is your preference about how you're notified? So Kathy Pearl again, she's mentioned that she doesn't like the idea of the device sitting in the corner barking out commands at you. And Frank from Speakeasy has also echoed that kind of thing, that he doesn't really think that it's a good idea for a device to be sitting there shouting at you. So what other ways is there then? If it's not a good idea for the device just to start shouting things at you, how would you do it? So Kathy suggested using lights and different coloured lights, and that's what Alexa does at the moment. It'll light up yellow if they've got a notification. It just draws your attention to the fact that there is something there waiting for you. Adva11 has weighed in and said that it's a good idea as a developer, bad idea as a user. Thank you for saying that, because that's what I was thinking when I was posting the poll in the first place. I was hoping that someone would say that, so wicked. I think it has to happen, but in the least intrusive way. For starters, I don't see why developers can't send notifications to the Alexa app. That's what you can do with Google Assistant, is you can send stuff to the phone that's running Google Assistant, or the Google Assistant app. But is that a good idea? So Luciana Alexander has said that it's a good idea if it's executed well. Feedback's an important part of the interaction. Two things that concern me. One is privacy and one is dependency on app usage. I see some comments about sending notifications to the app, but we should be aiming towards hands-free. Ben Sauer from Clear Left has said, I feel very strongly that we like to use voice UI because we're a little exhausted with some of the digital world. If we apply the same metaphors, it will only annoy. Exactly, and that's a recurring theme that's come up throughout the podcast, is people that try and take the mobile principles and concepts and just apply them in the voice space. And broadly speaking, it doesn't tend to work that well. So there's mixed and a bit of a divide there about whether sending push notifications to an app is actually a good idea. So there's different ways of doing notifications. There's one on Alexa, which is just the yellow light flashing. There's one with Google Actions, which is just sending notifications to the app. And then you've got the idea of the device just barking out commands. So there's mixed opinions on all of that, but the one that seems to get most positive sort of sentiment towards it is the idea of the light flashing. So what about context then? So Voice Strategist, again, in that original tweet I mentioned further up, is talking about how context is important, and that is echoed by David Contreras. I say Contreras. Is it Contreras? Contreras? Sounds Spanish, I don't know. Apologies again, I'm probably messing up everyone's names here. Apologies if I said your name wrong, but the main point is that you've hit the nail on the head by saying that context is important. So how do we then understand context? How can we use context as a way of serving more relevant notifications? And again, Voice Strategist is saying, while I believe in voice first, I also see the value in other senses. Context can be added. How many people are in the room? Am I at work or out on the move? Am I driving? Notification systems can be smart enough to infer priority based on such factors. Sounds like a really good idea. How do we do that in practice though? And here we have Miles Zielnik. Again, apologies. Zielnik. I'm going to say Zielnik. Feels right. Miles Zielnik. It's much more invasive than a phone push notification. How do you know the context of the situation when pushing? Are people at home or at work? What room are they in? You need a lot of data to answer these, but how you get it can be tricky. And that's it, isn't it? I mean, context sounds like in future it would be really useful to use people's context to send them relevant notifications based on the preferences for the preferential side and then also the critical ones. But how do you go about understanding context? And I don't know whether or not we're at a place yet where we can do that. But if you're working on stuff that's based on context, notifications based on context, give us a shout, drop us a line on Twitter, because it'd be interesting to know what you've been doing and whether you can advance this discussion anymore. There was also another theme which is all around opt-in and control. So how do you get people to opt in, and then how do you control things like the frequency and the type? We mentioned the different types, whether it's a flashing light or the barking device. How do you control all that sort of stuff? And broadly speaking, everybody was saying that it needs to be controlled by users. So we have Studio Flow. I think notifications are a good idea. For voice apps to truly find their utility, they have to have core functionality. Communicating new information to users is part of that. Must have rigorous user controls and have spam blocking built in, as Amazon have done. So what do we mean by user controls? Let's have a look at Scott Jensen, who's saying that it just means that you need to give users control. Again, that's another one that's echoed. I like the LED example from before, maybe a voice command to read them out. Giorgio Rubino is saying, you voted for a good idea, but opt-in and opt-out will have to have real control over the user. Otherwise, there'll be a huge rebellion against unwanted push notifications, and it'll cause premature end of voice first on smart speakers. Voice strategist, again, maybe control priority levels easily adjusted via voice. For example, hey Alexa, I'm in working mode now, or I'm in family mode now, with each intent having different predefined settings for notifications. And then Speakeasy have agreed with voice strategist. It can work, but it needs to be super controllable. And this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. How do you control all of those different contexts and all of those different notification types? Sounds as though that's going to be a bit of a big overhead from a user perspective in terms of setting up what notifications you want from which actions or which skills or which devices and what rooms. And it just sounds at the moment, given where we are at the moment, that sounds like a bit of a challenge. But it's a really good idea, and that would be the ideal situation. I totally agree with that. And now let's hop to Adver Levin's comment of saying that it sounds like it's a good idea for developers. That's kind of been a theme that's going through this, is that it's a good idea for developers, might not be a good idea for users. I thought that would come up, as I mentioned, because that was my initial thoughts. I think I've changed a little bit now because I've been enlightened by this discussion about how some of the critical notifications can be really important and how there's different ways that you can send those notifications to different devices. So I think my mind's been changed in terms of, I don't think it is just a developer one. I think there is some utility and some use there for users. But it's interesting that seems to be a running theme. So again, Scott Jensen, I wouldn't be surprised at all that devs want this. It's not inherently a bad idea, but more that it can be easily abused. And again, that reflects what Giorgio Rubino was saying about it being potentially dangerous. So there we go. That was broadly speaking the discussion and the broad themes that came out of it. I think that, as voice strategist said, that it does depend on the priority of information. I think we've defined that well now with critical and preferential notifications. We've discussed context and how that can play a really interesting role and that could provide some value, but at the moment I think we're a little bit limited in terms of identifying context. But it'll be interesting to do some further research into those two areas. And if anyone's working on context-based notifications or critical versus preferential notifications and you want to contribute to the discussion, hit us up on Twitter or comment on this video. We discussed the different types of notifications that you can have, so flashing lights versus devices barking controls at you or pushing stuff to the app and the benefits or drawbacks that might bring. And then we discussed the whole opt-in and control thing, and broadly speaking, everyone does think that users should have control over all this stuff, but quite how you give them control and how it all comes about, how you actually go about setting your preferences and all that stuff is still up for debate. And is it just a developer request or is it going to add value to users? I think my mind's changed now. I do think it will add value to users, but it probably does stem from developers. But the developers are the ones that are leading the way in this space at the moment anyway. So I think if we should listen to anyone, it should be them. So let's get on with the results then. You might have sensed a little bit of what the results are based on the discussions. There hasn't been a great deal of negativity in the discussion, to be perfectly honest. It's been broadly positive, so it won't surprise you to learn 74% of people thought that it was a good idea and 26% of people thought that it was a bad idea. So there is still some reservation there, but broadly speaking, people think it's broadly speaking a good idea. So there we have it. Are notifications a good idea on smart speakers and voice first devices? Yes, they are.